Hello, this is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune. This podcast will be devoted to a question we sometimes do touch upon on Kali Tribune, that is a seemingly merely political question of the difference between left and right. But this question is that is the full breadth and width of this difference is far deeper than mere political difference or juxtaposition of two opposites of political spectrum. This question is, I would say, even metaphysical. I think the good sign of this, or the reliable sign of this, is this clear cut of something that is historical, that is happening in our temporal world in two opposite, diametrically opposed poles. This is not something that just happens in human society, because nothing we have in a social world, in historical societies, exactly corresponds to this archetypal left and right, and I do believe that this indicates to underlying unity that exists between these two outlooks, or these two principles of waging politics, waging political battles of modernity, because as we all know, it's very discutable and very arguable, can we at all speak about left and right before modernity, before French Revolution? Truth, truth be told, the notion that left and right were invented, that is to say, that they sprang up in a consequence of French Revolution as the division of a revolutionary covenant, this proto-parliament of revolutionary France, where you have the hill and the swamp, that was the left and the right, hill and the valley they called them, and then you had in the middle what they called swamp, those, let's call them moderates, and so on, and that this is the original instance of left and right division. I think the case is well argued that this division already existed in various forms, although it was not always called like that. There is also a theological background in denoting something left and right as those that are on the left side or left hand of God, those that are on the right side, and so on. We won't go into that. Just to note that this division indicates perhaps to something deeper than mere politics and deeper than, God forgive me, mere history, because when talking about metaphysics, or talking about theology, or talking about even prayer life of successful prayer life of one individual, we are talking, I think at least, things much deeper than what we usually call history, these societal changes and so on and so forth. Now, this is one of those podcasts that are in fact inspired by question we get on Kali Tribune. Question was asked by a commenter by going by the pseudonym Cartman, and it is the product of discussion about some, let's say, right-wing pseudo-religious, or even pseudo-right-wing internet personalities that we on Kali Tribune were asked to give our opinion about, and more or less declined, because we don't deal in providing opinions on individuals on this site, only in the case that they represent something substantial, some substantial idea, or some substantial deviation, or God willing, some substantial, let's say, excellence, but in this case they are not. But what this discussion yielded was one of the questions that bothered me a lot throughout my life, and bothers me a lot, and will bother me in the future probably, but a bit less, because I think I could have at least portion of an answer to this question. The question, in paraphrase, Cartman asked us, somewhat rhetorically, is if right to these nominally right-wing, or let's say alt-right or religious right, or some kind of pseudo-virtual internet far-right people, why they are so easily shunned. And one of also there was a mention of Alfred Rosenberg here, who was not virtual intellectual, who was arguably not an intellectual at all. He wouldn't like to call himself intellectual. I think he was a like a nominal ideologue of National Socialism. And the question is, if it is easy to dismiss someone like Rosenberg, but I quote, "However, I have yet to hear why Sartre and his support of Mao, that is Mao Zedong, and numerous intellectuals and artists who supported the communist regimes does not invalidate their work." This is very interesting question. It may seem like not being very interesting because it is often posed, but it is very rarely answered in a satisfactory manner. Now, I would say that Sartre's work, to a large extent, dismisses itself in a philosophical sense. I'm thinking mainly about his pre-communist days, where he was an existentialist with his Being and Nothingness, and essays on emotions, existentialism is humanism, and so on and so forth. But perhaps even more so with his later ravings in communism. And when we take his life and the way he acted and contradictions of his political stance, and as is very, very often in leftists, his complete discrepancy between his personal irresponsibility and misanthropy and his quote-unquote high ideals. There is a ground to dismiss, and of course support of Mao Zedong, with whom I think likes of Sartre never had any problems, even if they knew everything about him. One of the good examples of this on the left is Slavoj Žižek, and I would refer to one of my videos on Žižek's apologia of Robespierre and revolutionary terror. Most of those talking heads, intellectuals, are closet Stalinists. They are mostly people who mourn the passing of Soviet Union, and will always be ready to find a rationale for any kind of crime done by those regimes, more or less similarly or analogously as some right-wing intellectuals will pardon Hitler or likes of him, and so on. And this is a very fair argument, but something is missing in it. And this is, Cartman, why you ask this question, because you don't know why, and I think it's no wonder you don't know why, because this is a very difficult thing. It is very easy to compare the number of victims, to take historical reality of what communism, which was in effect the ultimate realization of left-wing ideas in 20th century. No amount of this evidence kind of satisfies people, and not only people on the left who then reject those arguments or evade them. The reason why leftists are not beaten in debates with this is, I think, deeper, and I think it has to do with the nature of modernity. Namely, when we take somebody like Alfred Rosenberg or his, uh, let's say, uh, self-proclaimed successor in a way, Francis Parker Yockey, far less famous, or people like that. Their forte was not intellectual. They had a huge problem with intellect, not because they lacked internet, but intellect, I'm sorry, but they based their political projects and philosophy on assumption that intellect is deficient, that intellect is not human power but human deficiency. And they were very outright and outspoken about it. We have it in Nazis, what Goebbels would call jüdischer Intellektualismus, the rejection of science, of Jewish physics, as they call it, or Jewish chemistry, and such ideas. But underlying everything was this enmity towards intellect, anti-intellectualism. Left, on the other hand, although in some areas and in some nooks and crannies of this large political group, it does share this enmity towards intellect in people like Foucault or earlier new leftists like Marcuse and some others, not all Frankfurt School. Adorno was not enemy of intellect, he just didn't know what to do with it. Left at least claims and clings to intellectuality. Now, communism itself was a closed, absolute societal theory that is absolute philosophy, absolute quasi-metaphysics, metaphysics without transcendence, metaphysics which seeks transcendence in the sense that the world had to be built anew, in a sense. But it does it in such a manner that it uses a rational argument. I think therein lies the crux of the problem, because in the process, communism, in the process of realizing itself, communism did far more damage to humanity than its contenders. Although this contender, this globalist, let's say, ideological mishmash we have now is one contender that haven't been defeated by communism and fascism, but it defeated them. Now I am purposefully avoiding to call it liberalism, as Alexander Dugin calls it, because it's too first, it's too simple to call it that, and second, Dugin always has underlying agenda in his philosophy, and I in no way, shape, and form want to promote it. But I also sometimes have a slip of attention, let's call it, or focus, and use this term liberal to denote something that is in fact not liberal. And because American conservatives like to use it to denote this identitarian crazes on the left, but liberal is not the proper term to denote them. The thing is that modernity, when we talk about right and left, we are talking about modernity. We are not talking about old Byzantium or Italian city-states from Quattrocento, something like that. No, we are talking about modernity. We must never forget that systems like fascism, Italian fascism or German National Socialism, and their offshoots all over Europe and in Latin America, they were not systems that were aimed at returning to some kind of idealized or even real past. They were not conservative, they were revolutionary, that's the first thing. They were not traditionalist either. because traditionalist politics, if something like that is possible, or if something like that can be described in modernity, would be such politics that doesn't recreate things anew, but uh, attempts to be enlightened by the principles that transcend politics and that are eternal, that can maybe change form here and there, but are always here. That is the idea that this is the idea that completely ejects the idea of progress. On the other hand, both right and left wing we are mostly talking about here rely on idea of progress, on evolutionist metaphysics, on crudist Darwinism in for instance, in example of Nazis, or in most regimes that were built on very strong racial supremacy factor. We have idea of evolution as a conditio sine qua non. This idea is crucial for communism also. It's enough to say that how Marx was elated by Darwin, and this is no accident. In Darwin he found at last metaphysics that he can use far better than Hegel's metaphysics, because Hegel, with all his faults, was not a racial supremacist in this Darwinist sense, that is biological, with the idea of absolute biological givens as alpha and omega of human condition. And this underlies old Marxism, and Marx as a person was extremely prone to such way of thinking, and it was indeed prevalent in Europe to think in these terms. But they share, what I want to say, they share quite a lot. They share the aim. The aim is to progress the modernity to its utmost. The difference is, however, what is the end goal. In Nazism, for instance, we had this idea of something that white nationalists or alt-right are trying to reboot and revive and make acceptable to larger masses, and in a completely, of course, different way than Nazis did it in their time. And this is idea of creation of pure militaristic totalitarian states, or totalitarian civilization, better to say, because in Germany, if we take Germany as an example, it was 1,000 years Reich, millennial Reich, supremacy of Germans, something like that we have in Dugin, and for instance with his idea of Russian supremacy, but not on racial but deeper and even worse basis, on the basis of spatial destiny of Russian people and so on. Those ideas point to the future. This is what I want to say. They are all progressive in a sense. When you take, for instance, Nazism and their attack on Poland, I remember listening to one Polish, I think, filmmaker, but I don't remember his name. Who was it? One of those famous Polish directors. He said, as he remembers as a child, when Blitzkrieg hit Poland, and Poland was the first country to experience the brunt of Blitzkrieg, he felt that it was something akin to the invasion from another planet because of technological aspect of it. He said they have a feeling that they are being grinded by machine, and you have this famous event when whole division of Polish, I think hussars, that is the mounted soldiers with spears, attacked German armored brigade tanks and armored cars, and with predictable outcome. But in this case, if anybody was conservative, romantic traditionalist, it was those Polish soldiers, not German German tank crews. So the most important thing is that all of this we fights for modernity, whether it's Nazism, communism, whether it's this globalist sustainable development, democracy that is manipulated, I'd say technocracy would be maybe the best term to describe it. And it's a question of what is adequate to modernity. I think that reason why right-wingers never truly get the better of those leftists as Sartre or Zizek and such people is that these leftists are more attuned to the spirit of the age, that is, to modernity, and they are more attuned to one more thing, to intellect. They are misusing it. They are using intellect that is detached from reality. They are using intellect to create theories, absolute systems that are a priori and that are only in consequence apply to reality, and then reality has to adjust to them. This is misuse of intellect, but this is very important. It is not negation of intellect. Whereas somebody like Rosenberg and somebody even perhaps like Spengler would say that intellect is a form of degeneration of instincts, of civilization, is a kind of degeneration of vitality of peoples, and so on and so forth. And intellect, in fact, in my opinion, is the main power of human being. This is the power of soul, that is not merely a discursive power of making and inferences, synthetical inferences, then dividing those inferences, asking questions, and so on and so forth. There is a lot more to it than that. Not only a lot more in a sense that we add something more as an accessory, it is something else. It is what the man truly is. This is, for instance, to take only one quote, Aristotle would say, nous or intellect is the man himself. This is the other name for person, or for heart, or there are various terms for this power, and this type of right wing is in conflict with this power by its very definition, and I think this is the reason why it loses. Because sometimes this right-wing reaction is a reaction for this empty mind of modernity, that is the intellect that only uses pure abstract notions devoid of reality, devoid of that juice that we recognize in life, that makes life worth living, and we can never define it because it is more powerful than our concepts. And then you have leftists that deny its existence, for instance, deny the importance of continuity, of tradition, of religion, of institutions, of having ideas, for instance, that institutions are a priori oppressive, and so on and so forth, and we have to let loose our instincts, and so on and so forth. This is something that can provoke into irrationalism, into being anti-intellect. But this anti-intellect stance is a very modern stance. And it is very congenial what the left does in some sense, but what left doesn't do in great leftist thinkers, which are rather scarce now, but people like Sartre, for instance, I don't think he was that great, but okay, he was a big name in his time. They, with all their faults, use intellect. They argue. Somebody like Francis Parker Yockey or something like that does not argue. and does not accept the power of reason, enlightened from above, or a reason taken in itself, a reason in every sense. And this is a fatal flaw. And this is a fatal flaw that is fatal not only because it is not adequate to modernity, but because it is not adequate to reality. And it, in the last instance, it is against God. It is against principles that make intellect an intellect. Whereas in left we have rather a kind of inversion of the right idea we have in communism. I'm not first one to claim this, that in communism you have a lot of this Christian structure of even using the terms, the very terms communism, communio, or Eucharist, in fact, or union of final union of worker and abstract citoyen or bourgeois that gets absorbed in the working class in one unity of humanity. Those are terms that you would not be able to use, not only if you haven't had Hegel, but even if you haven't had councils of the church that discussed the nature of Jesus and nature of Trinity and the possibility or reality of something not being created but being begetted, and how two natures can be two persons in one nature, and so on and so forth. How can some realities be made so fluid to interpenetrate each other, to imbibe each other? You need ancient metaphysics, you need theology, Christianity, you need a legacy of this to make something like communism. But the communism, of course, is inversion. It is a far cry, but it has some relation to it. Whereas when you take this irrationalism that is sometimes prevalent on the right, you have none of that, and you are insofar as you don't have any relation to this intellectuality, you lack power, because as it seems, in the end, the weapons and the raw force is not the thing that wins modernity after all. So this would be my 5 cents in attempt to answer these questions, which is very interesting and very painful, very troublesome, very troubling, especially and for me, because I am appalled by the fact that whatever good arguments I can find against some idiot that has no problem supporting Mao and then being politically correct and go call out, I don't know, some let's say right, more to the right, more conservative regime for say killing 5 innocent people, whereas these guys, by some estimations, killed over 40 million Mao Zedong in Cultural Revolution. It appalls me to kingdom come. I'm angry at myself and at the world that I cannot somehow convince him that he is an idiot, shithead, and that he is devious. But I think that there is more to it than other these potential interlocutors' stupidity. There can be more to it. Maybe because the one aspect of this kind of thinking that keeps it afloat, especially in modernity, is its bid for rationality. Whereas ideas, for instance, like Heidegger's, whom I didn't mention till the last minute, who is a very good example, are completely rejecting rationality and therefore far quickly sinking under the surface. Well, I hope this to some extent answered, or better to say, shown the way towards perhaps answering this question, and will incite some reflection in hearer, listener of this podcast. Thank you very much for your attention. This was Branko Malić of Kali Tribune signing out.